So hi, everybody. Really glad to see you in this last session of the day. I get the very great honor of introducing Robin DeRosa, our featured speaker for the day. One of the featured speakers for the day, but we're in this room, so she's our featured speaker. So I'm not going to talk a lot. Just a reminder to myself to silence my own phone, because Amber Alerts and hostage situations and who knows. So that will be useful for today. So I will turn it over to Robin from the State University and let her go. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think I am mic'd, and does that sound good to everybody? Yeah. Okay. I'm really happy to be here. I'm starting to feel like SUNY is a second home for me because I've been working with some of the campuses around some interdisciplinary stuff, but then primarily around open education. And every time I come, I'm incredibly impressed by the passion of the individuals on the campuses, but also the way that your system is making a real effort to work across institutions, which is not something we see all that much in public higher education right now. So I'm really excited to be here with you. There may have been some of you who were recently at the CUNY SUNY OER showcase in New York City that I was at, so a few of these slides from the beginning might look familiar to you, and then I'll try to take it in a different direction at the end. But what I want to talk to you today about is primarily related to open education, but also public higher education in general, and some of the challenges that we're facing and some of the ways that we might think about talking about our mission as faculty and staff who work in public institutions. So I'm going to start by talking about basic definitions of open. Some of you, like this is actually your full-time job, is to do open. Others of you are sort of just dipping your toes in the water. So we'll catch up with some basic definitions about open and talk about how we actually practice that in our work, especially in our pedagogies, and then think about why we might want to build programs, courses, assignments, institutions, statewide missions perhaps around the idea of open. And that might lead us to ask some new questions about what open education could be by the time we get to the end of the presentation. So I'm going to start with a familiar idea. A long, long time ago, actually in this galaxy, public higher education was fairly affordable. And so were textbooks. So we're going to start by talking about what's happened since that galaxy drifted apart. So many of you have seen charts like this. Actually, my favorite version of this graph has another index line on there, which is healthcare, because we're all so accustomed to talking about, oh my God, healthcare, the rising cost of healthcare. But actually, the healthcare line is lower than the textbook line when you graph that out. And I feel like that's always kind of sobering information. So really, when you're looking at the consumer price index, what we're seeing in the rise of textbook costs looks to me and also to the economist who made this graph like a classic case of price gouging. So faculty have been asked to pay attention to textbook costs. I know as a faculty member for the last 20 or so years, I always paid attention to textbook costs in the sense that I would have a couple of books to choose from, and I would, like a good professor, choose the less expensive textbook. And I sort of thought that was where my duty ended in terms of paying attention to this issue. In fact, if you look at some of the research that shows how faculty select textbooks, you can see that cost is real low on the graph of the things that we tend to care about. And actually, it kind of depends how you crunch the numbers. Sometimes that moves up a little depending on what metrics you use to ask these questions. But for the most part, you can see that cost is pretty low. Some of this makes sense to me as a professor because proven efficacy, honestly, there's nothing that's going to trump that for me, right? The idea of the quality of the materials and how they work for my students. But cost is pretty embarrassingly low, maybe, on this. And really, you get this idea of this professor sort of sitting in an office somewhere in a tweed suit with a pipe saying, you know, I can't be bothered, really, right? And I really was interested in whether this was true. I think what's more interesting is it's probably less the tweed suit and the pipe affect than it is that only 29% of faculty are aware of open educational resources. In fact, probably a small cohort of the people in this room right now are not aware of open educational resources. But this lack of awareness is probably one of the main drivers for why that cost issue is so low on that index, right? It's that faculty don't really understand what options we have in reducing the cost of textbooks. I think also part of the problem here is that for faculty, lowering costs cannot be a rallying cry. And let me give you an example of why. In my institution, which is a public regional institution in New Hampshire, part of the state system, very similar to many of your SUNY campuses, we are doing a lot of things to cut costs on campus right now. And most of these things are not things that I rally behind, right? Like, I'm so glad we cut these positions. Or I'm really glad we're trimming foreign language, right? That's great. Or curtailing the library hours. That's a wonderful thing for learning, right? So the problem with cost, right, is that you can't use that as a way to argue for improvements in education because too many cost-cutting measures right now are decimating learning outcomes for our students, in my opinion, right? So I think part of the way we need to think about this, particularly as faculty, is that this really isn't about cost. This is about access. So when we curtail the library hours to save money, we actually reduce access to learning. But when we switch to OER, to free textbooks, we actually increase access to learning, right? So that's an inverse relationship around cost that I think is really distinct about open textbooks. So I want to switch the message now to talk not about lowering the cost of textbooks, which is really like I would never be going around the nation on a speaking tour to say, let's lower the cost of textbooks. First of all, I'm an English professor by training. We don't even use textbooks, right? Textbooks are not going to be anybody's rallying cry in my experience with faculty. So if we talk instead about educational access, the conversation starts getting, I think, quite a bit more interesting and compelling. If we switch from access to books to access to knowledge, we're going to see an expanded set of interests that are going to start becoming part of the open movement beyond just textbooks. So let's look at what I think is really one of the most compelling graphs for talking to faculty about open resources. This comes from the Florida Virtual Campus, and they've done two studies, one in 2012, and then they sort of replicated again in 2016 with over 20,000 students in their sample. And what this shows is the effect of textbook costs on student success. So these are students reporting what happens to them when they can't afford course materials. And honestly, it's when I saw this graph as a faculty member that I really started understanding what we were talking about when we were talking about textbooks. So 47.6% of students report taking fewer classes because they can't afford the course materials. That's actually a really interesting number on a lot of levels. So first of all, when students take fewer classes and fewer credits, it takes them longer to get to graduation. And when we extend time to graduation, we decrease the likelihood of graduation, right? So that's a really important number. It's also pretty interesting from an institutional perspective because institutions make money on credits and institutions gain reputation on completion. So it's kind of a lose-lose for both students and for institutions when students take fewer credits. Also, look at those drop and withdrawal rates, right? 26% of students drop in classes early in the semester when they find out how much those materials are going to cost. Or students actually trying to participate and keep up in a class, but they can't afford the materials, so ultimately they withdraw, which means they're paying a big fee and getting no ultimate credit for that class, right? Can impact also their financial aid. 37.5% earn a poor grade because they couldn't afford to buy the textbook. 20% of students reporting that they fail a class because they can't afford the learning materials. And no surprise to anyone here who's ever taught a class in college, 67% almost of students reporting that they sometimes don't buy required textbooks for classes. So I have this experience all the time where I'm teaching a class and there's just a very small cohort, usually in a class of say 25 or 30, there'll be like 2 students who don't have the book. Sometimes one of those students will just not have the book at the beginning, right? Because they'll say, I'm just waiting for my check to come in, and then I'm going to buy it, or I'm trying to get it on reserve, or I ordered it cheaper online, an old issue, it's going to be in 3 weeks, I just have to wait, right? I'm sharing this book. All of these things impact student learning, and sometimes the most vulnerable learners are the ones who start out with that 2 or 3 week lag at the beginning. And there's really nothing worse than starting a class where you're already a little bit vulnerable, getting 3 weeks behind the rest of your class. When I saw this, I realized this is not about the cost of textbooks. It's about whether students are going to succeed in college. And suddenly, that became my job, right, as a professor, to start paying more attention to this issue. Unlike most things in higher education, in fact, I'd say almost everything else in higher education, this is something that we could solve yesterday for the most part, right? If you teach, for example, a freshman or sophomore level course that is being taught at most US or Canadian colleges, you can go out and grab an openly licensed textbook right now and replace that commercial textbook. These openly licensed textbooks are available digitally online for free, or you can get them printed for somewhere in the vicinity of $5 to $20, depending on the book. And I will tell you, when you do a printed version of an OER textbook, depending on where you get it from, most of the time, you can fake somebody out. They won't even know that it's an OER. They look like regular textbooks. They have pretty covers. They have nice illustrations, right? They look like the kinds of textbooks that you buy in any bookstore. So the fact that these books exist but faculty don't know about them is one of the main things, I think, that we really have to correct almost immediately in order to start fixing some of those graphs that we saw before. These are books from OpenStax, but there's lots of campuses and universities that are publishing open textbooks that you can search for with the help of your librarians who can help you find those books. But for me, once I realized that I could replace my commercial textbooks with OER, it was only one thing that I really needed to do if I wanted to care about access to learning, right? What are the other barriers that were keeping my students from accessing knowledge in my courses? So after OER, I started working on other things that to me now seemed intimately related to textbook costs. So for example, and I like to show this picture because when I say that I opened a food pantry like outside my office, it sounds very grand. But this is the food pantry so we already have a really nice food pantry on our campus. But the reason I wanted a localized one right outside my office, inside my department, was to help my team, right, my staff in some ways, understand that this is food insecurity is an academic issue. If your students are hungry, they won't be able to concentrate in class. If your students can't get to class because their car broke down or they can't afford gas, that's an academic issue, right? So we started stocking gas cards in our food pantry, and we put together a ride co-op so that people could send emergency texts to each other when they couldn't find rides to campus. We weren't able to start a child care sort of in-house. I wanted to basically have like a little daycare, you know, on the side of my office. Apparently the liability issues are very challenging. But we were able to start a student-to-student child care co-op that basically says if your child care falls through on this particular day, you're able to use our text messaging system in order to ask other students in the program if they'd watch your kid on campus for a couple of hours while you go to class, right? These are all just really easy community-based grassroots things that we do in addition to the larger scale stuff that my university is doing to indicate that just like textbook costs, all of these things are related to the success of my students in my class studying their disciplines. I'm trying to think if there's other things on here that you might be more interested in talking about after the rest of the presentation. So we'll go back to it if you want to talk about green light grading or the laptop checkouts or any of that stuff. But really, that was just sort of the preamble to the stuff that I really enjoy talking about, which is what's exciting to me about open is not just that it opens those domains to accessing knowledge, right? Come in, you're well-fed, you've got your ride to campus, you've got a device that you can afford to access your online classes, you've got access to your broadband, we're working on all of these issues, and you can get there and be at the table. The next thing that's really important for me is that my students also have access to what I'm thinking of as knowledge creation. That they're not just consumers, but contributors. And this really pushes back on some of the current rhetoric in higher ed, right? Job training, for example. I don't just want to train my students for a labor market. I want my students to be transforming the labor market that they're going to graduate into, right? I want them to be shaping the knowledge commons, not just absorbing. So when I work with open, I work with open because it gives me a language to talk about students as contributors, and that's the kind of thing that I want to focus on now. And I'm going to do this by telling a little story about how I came into open, which will be a somewhat familiar narrative to folks who've seen this before. I started off learning about this. I saw a keynote speech by Cable Green, who's the education director of Creative Commons. Creative Commons makes the open licenses that allow us to share these materials for free. So when I saw Cable speak, he was talking about, we should openly license learning materials so students don't get gouged by for-profit companies that are making these textbooks. And all of a sudden I had this epiphany. Because my PhD is in early American literature. So I was teaching a survey course of American lit that was basically like 1400 to 1800. So if you're a librarian, for example, right, and you know literature 14 to 1800, what's unique about that? It's all in the public domain. So my students were buying the Heath Anthology of American Literature. They were paying like $90 for basically an anthology of public domain American literature, which I thought was absolutely like the most American thing I'd ever heard of, right? So when I had heard Cable talk, I thought, I think we could use open licensing. We could replace this. We could make an OER anthology out of public domain literature. So I put together, it's really hard to see up there, and I feel like a little ant down here in this ginormous room. But that's nothing fancy. What that is a Google sheet, which to me at the time was fancy. I was like, oh, I made a spreadsheet, right? Remember, I'm an early Americanist, friends, right? So this is all a brave new world for me. But I made this little Google spreadsheet, and I went on Facebook to our department page, and I asked students, does anybody want to participate with me in going out and finding this public domain literature, building this anthology? And about 10 students showed up, a couple of alums who had just taken the course, and some students who were about to take it, who were pretty stoked, because they were like, hey, I'll help you do this and save myself $90, right, for the next semester. So I had to train them a little bit, right, because you can't just grab something off the internet and assume that that's public domain and we can put it in our book, right? So we did a little bit of training. Really I created like a 10-minute training module to make sure they knew what they were doing. And off they went, and we all sort of crowdsourced the creation of this anthology. I did pay them, so let me just put this right on the front end. So I went to my provost, and then I went to my department chair, and I just got no, there's no money. And this was because this was like before open was even a thing in some ways. It was just catching on, right? So I'm sure they thought it was crazy. But I ended up paying students out of my own pocket to build the anthology. That sounds like amazing, except I'll tell you the total cost that I paid was just about $400. Which was a year in which I did not donate to my university in any other capacity. I donated to the Open Anthology of American Literature. And the reason I say that is that those students were not in a class with me at the time, right? They were just doing this. They were actually volunteering to do it. But I wanted to mark, at least as best I could, that the production of open educational resources is academic labor. So when we do that, we don't want to make that work invisible, right? We want to somehow say, even if they're free to use, they're not free to create. So, so we put that together and created the first version of the Open Anthology of Early American Literature. You can see up top the list of my students who were authors of that first version. And we came in September, and I said, there's no cost for the course. And it was like, she's amazing, right? And then the students started using the book, and they despised it. They hated it. And the reason was, and I didn't see this clearly because I have a PhD in early American literature. So like these, you know, to me it's just second nature. I've taught these texts so many times. I forgot that, you know, when they get to Cabeza de Vaca at the beginning of that course, they're like, I don't understand. He's Spanish and he's in Florida. Like, this is not how America was discovered. You know, I'm like, oh God, right? But because what were they missing? They were missing the introductions. They were missing the footnotes. They were missing the maps and the illustrations, right? They were missing all that infrastructure that gave them a little bit of a foothold with some material that was quite challenging. So it came like an epiphany, but obviously it's an obvious epiphany, I think, at this point. What we did is we just had the students start putting that stuff into the textbook. So for example, I think that, I can't see, that's Hannah. Okay, so that's Christopher Columbus. Before we got to the Columbus unit, a couple of weeks in advance, Hannah went out, researched some stuff, wrote an introduction, got some public domain images to add in, and she built out an introduction. We had other students able to add in footnotes. People started making videos once we figured out, my God, we can put anything we want in here, right? So this guy, Jonathan, liked to make these really like hyper-edited intro videos. So let me ask you this, what undergraduate does not want to see one of his or her colleagues, right, another undergraduate, give you a 2-minute introduction to the Haitian Revolution, right? That's what they want. They want, tell me what I need to know. This is confusing. I actually have a hard time identifying what's confusing about the Haitian Revolution, right? They're quite adept at that. So it turned out the materials they were creating for our textbook, in my opinion, were superior to the materials in the Heath Anthology. They were perfectly targeted to the learners for what they needed. In addition, the students were really invigorated by the idea that they were becoming authors, that they were reading each other's work. And then, because the book was online and openly licensed, they became really invigorated when they noticed that other universities were starting to use our text. And now suddenly that authorship became real to them, and it was pretty exciting. I layered in a little app called Hypothesis as a plug-in on the book. This allows for in-text close reading and shared public annotations. And man, did they start having fun with that. When I first did this in the first semester, Hypothesis was in development, so we were part of a beta experiment. And the Hypothesis developers counted the number of annotations that those 18 students in that class put in, and it was over 10,000 annotations over the course of that one semester. It's possible they were annotating the Heath Anthology that robustly, but I don't think so, right? So they really started enjoying the textbook as kind of a community gathering space, a place where their work went, and it just became exciting. When I finished the course, I ended up getting a different job in my university, which I was super excited about. But I really didn't want to leave that anthology behind. It was such an exciting project. But you know, my colleague, Abby, who took my position when I moved, she forked that anthology and used the skeleton that we had built that semester and started adding to it the next semester and created a far superior version with her students over the course of the next semester. That's a conglomeration of both of them. And then, I mean, that just gets better and better. It's like, and then a set of knives, right? The next thing that happened was Rebus Community, which is a new kind of ecosystem for open publishing, got excited about the book and took it on as one of their first projects They got a team of over 20 academics who took the first versions of the book, so my book, Abby's book, another guy, Tim's book from Graceland University, and took those versions, put them all together, and got all of these academics working on it with a grant from Hewlett, right? Remember, it started with $400, right? And now it's funded by Hewlett. That's my original table of contents, and here's the new one that when this book gets released it's live now, but it's being built out. When it's finished, I think in probably a few more months, this book is going to replace the Heath Anthology, the Bedford St. Martin, and the Norton Anthology of American Literature. I don't know who will ever use those commercial textbooks again when this version becomes available. But what's so exciting to me is like the version we made in my class, I mean, it was not good, right? And actually, I took some heat one time because somebody said, like, I don't like how you denigrate your students. I was like, no, but really. I mean, we all knew. It was a draft, right? It really wasn't terrific. But we put that in the Commons, and we invited people to please come and use the open license on this, which gives us the ability to revise and remix and improve this material. And that's what people did. And in this Rebus version, some of my students' work will remain, right? So some of those introductions and some of that material that they added. Of course, a lot of people then ask me, you know, it's great for you with your public domain literature, but how is this applicable to me? Because I teach physics, you know. I really, truly believe this is a model that works for virtually any discipline. Textbook material, right? We're not talking about books, not books. Textbooks, right? Textbook material is not proprietary. The general knowledge in textbooks are the disciplinary foundations of a field. Nobody owns those. So the idea that students are great people to be explaining these things to other students just makes sense to me after seeing it in practice. You can't immediately just drop all of your materials and switch to this model. So for example, I'm making one now on the right there for my interdisciplinary studies program to replace that commercial textbook. It's a 3-year build. In the first year, we kept our commercial textbook and we worked from it, and students kind of rethought the material that was there and tried to improve the way it was presented. The second year, we lost the commercial textbook and we used lectures and other openly licensed articles and developed some more material, and in the third year, they'll do curation and editing of that, and then we'll have a nice solid book. So the idea that you can create these spaces and work with other people to kind of crowdsource the materials, bless you, I think is just incredibly exciting. And you don't have to do this, right? You can take an OpenStax textbook in Intro to Biology and just do this with a chapter here and there, or just do this with problem sets or questions in which you involve your students, not just in the consuming of the textbook information, but the creation as well. So I want to talk a little bit about how this all sort of transformed my way of thinking about teaching, which when I started working in open, I think I've been at Plymouth State for about 18 years now, and then teaching all through graduate school before that. So I felt like I was a good teacher before open came to me. You know, everything was in line and my students were enjoying my classes. So it really surprised me after that amount of time in the classroom to realize that there were domains related to teaching that I had not even explored before after all of those decades, really. So I think I spent most of my time kind of in these middle domains. The first is the domain of knowledge. That's basically the idea that I have content and I need to transmit it, right? I've got expertise, I've got a PhD, I've got, you know, these learning outcomes from my department or my field or my accreditors, and I have to make sure they know what they are. But I don't just want them to know them, I want them to be able to understand and also even apply them, right? So that understanding is like you don't just regurgitate the exact material, but you can put it in your own words. And that idea of sort of thriving with it is, you know, if you're going to learn some of the Native American tribal histories of the Northeast, well, then you might also have something to say about the Dakota pipeline issue, and you might be able to apply some of that historical knowledge to some of these contemporary situations. And I just spent, you know, 20 years enjoying those 3 domains because they are such important domains around teaching. But when I started working with open, I saw things open on either side of that. So first was that domain we talked about earlier, that survival domain. Can they access this knowledge if they can't afford the textbook, if they're hungry, if they're food insecure, if the cost of tuition is prohibitively high, right? What are the other pieces of advocacy work that I need to do to get them to come to the table so that I can transmit knowledge and be part of that? But then maybe the stuff that really excites me and the reason that I try to do this work with faculty is on the other end of that equation. How can I get my students not just to apply knowledge, to be able to say, oh yes, I can make a connection here, but also to be able to contribute something out into the commons that's going to change the shape of the world, change the shape of the field, for example. And how then will things look different after my students complete this course, right? Do I just want to give them a course and have everything be the same when the course ends? Or do we want to experience this course and have that course really shift what's out there in the actual world? So if I want to do that kind of contributory transformational work, what do the architectures need to look like in teaching in order to make this happen? And who should be building these architectures if we need to make some changes? So this is a slide that I use a lot, and sometimes I like to say, this is the slide I'm famous for, but you know, it's like Twitter famous, right? I'm famous with like the 14 people who think this stuff is as interesting as I do. But really, I had this kind of epiphany when I started thinking of the LMS, the Learning Management System. What do you guys have in your systems? Blackboard. So, okay. So let's go with Blackboard. I like to think about Blackboard as Alcatraz, right? It's locked down. It's hard to get things in, and it's hard to get things out, right? God help you. I took a course over from a colleague, and his stuff was in his Blackboard, and like it was like Fort Knox, right, to get myself added into his shell there. And I thought, well, gosh, this is not the architecture that I'm talking about. If I want students to transform knowledge and contribute to the world, you know, if they're locked down in the LMS, how is that work supposed to happen? So I thought, oh, what I really want is I want them to design like sort of homes of their own. And I want those homes to be different and distinct depending on the learner. I want them to feel connected to them, and I want them to have driveways and pathways that allow for people to come in and visit and collaborate. So instead of those shark-infested waters that keep people away, like in Blackboard, I want there to be an invitation to come, right? Sometimes the instructional designers get mad because it's like, you're just trying to get the people in Blackboard, right? Now I'm like, enough. But really, the symbolics of the LMS started to distress me when I really started thinking about them. In particular, so we have Moodle on my campus. So every semester, at the end of the semester, I would import my Moodle shell, you know, for the next time I was going to teach the course. And what happens when you do that, right, is that you take all the important stuff forward and you delete all the stuff that you don't need, which is everything your students created, right? The symbolics of that, it was like hit me kind of like a punch in the stomach. I mean, I almost get teary when I talk about it now because I went through so many years thinking this was just the norm of my profession, right, to flush my students' work away. And David Wiley calls that disposable assignments, right? Assignments that we know don't actually matter, and it's fine to delete or dispose of them. The old model before Moodle was, you know, pick up your paper from my office after I grade it, right? And summer comes, and there's a stack of papers, and then you just recycle them, right? So what kind of architectures do we want to build if we don't want to work in this way anymore? So I moved our program to Domain of One's Own, which is an institutional program. I can't remember now. It's in over 100 institutions. I think maybe quite a bit more than that. It's run by a company called Reclaim Hosting, but I started doing this before we had Domain of One's Own. But really what this meant was instead of giving students access into the Blackboard, I gave my students access to a website of their own, a domain of their own, where they could create the space that they wanted to share their work. You can see here an example of Jane's site. She's a conservation ecology major in the program that I run. So the program that I run is an interdisciplinary studies program. We have about 130 students doing customized, individualized majors, right? So they create them themselves. So Jane created a major in conservation ecology, and that's her site there. So let's talk about the sort of qualities of a site like this. So first of all, instead of drag and drop, many of you guys have ePortfolio products on your campus. We've got one called Mahara. We've also got one inside TaskStream, which is another sort of ed tech software. So these ePortfolio softwares are generally like, you know, place photo here, place bio here, upload Word documents to this spot, right? And they really don't look like anything else on the web. And sometimes they're intimately tied to your institution, and they're hard to sort of make things public after that. So instead, these are designed sites that students build from blank server, right? And again, my students are not necessarily technology people. I am teaching them all of this. I, again, have a PhD in early American literature, right? So the technology is doable, really, by anyone. But they design them from the ground up, not just a consumer of stuff on the screen, but now a creator and a contributor. Instead of having their data mined by whatever company, but also even the LMS, right? The LMS gives us all sorts of data on our students that our students really can't even see, right? Our students don't even know that we're collecting it. Instead, this puts the data with our students. The students can look at what's going on the back end of their sites, and they can share that or not share that, right? The agency is with them. And instead of that dreaded audience of one, right, writing for the professor, we can think about writing for the public now, which I think is actually different than writing for an audience. Writing for the public is a particular thing that professors are super bad at doing, right? The idea that we could start training the next generation of scholars to understand what it means to write for a public audience, I think is really compelling for the future of knowledge. Instead of just broadcasting, right, your perfect CV, the one paper that you did that was perfect, right? Let's build a web of synergies, right? A collaborative space where we can invite people in and say, I'm learning. I've built this anthology, it's halfway done, it's got problems, who can help me improve it? Especially for students, that's perfect, right? Because none of our students are done learning, right? They're all in the middle of something and they're all flawed. As an interdisciplinarian, I would sort of say we all are, and we can all be improved. But this is the kind of web that I'm hopeful about building. And of course, when the course ends, that website there stays with the students, right? Instead of flushing that stuff away, the student gets to decide what they keep, how they sort it, how they curate it, and what they do with it. So in our program, we changed the terminology. Instead of calling it an ePortfolio or a website, we call it an ePort to think about portals. A space of collaboration, to think about ports of call, an invitation for someone to come and pause there and work with me and maybe make a trade of some sort, right? Here's some examples of these ePorts in action. This is Madison. Her post was called, I'm not graduating on time and that's okay. So Madison had a daughter when she was 17 and in high school. This is all recorded on her blog, right? So I'm just talking about the stuff that she talks about all the time. And what's really amazing about Madison is that for her capstone project, her major is in women's health, and she blogged about the failures of sex education in middle and high schools in the United States. She talked about her own experience with sex education. She talked about having her daughter when she was young. And she started, as part of her project, a quote-unquote mommy blog, which is a thing, I did not know, but a mommy blog, where she's particularly targeting young mothers interested in pursuing an education and the complexity of that. She became someone that many people started to read. They read her research for her article that she wrote, and that's like a 20-page research article that she produced for that program. And they read her blog, which was kind of an applied project. They read the story of how she was making her way through college. I don't know what kind of other space would have allowed that to happen for Madison, right? The pulling in of those personal, the coursework, the research, and the applied projects, all of that stuff coming together on this ePort that she created. Here's her talking a little bit about the space. IDS, that's our program, Interdisciplinary Studies. You might think of it as an interdisciplinary program, but in some ways, it's also really a connected learning and open pedagogy program, right? That's the nexus is interdisciplinarity, connected learning, and open ped. So she says, IDS taught me to be responsible for my learning and growth. You learn to expand your returns. We do not post our homework to a hidden school-controlled website. We share our work for all the world to see. This idea of owning your own domain allows you to be confident in your work and take responsibility for what you're learning, how you make connections in the world, and how you share your knowledge. Over and over again, students were feeling like these architectures were empowering, that they were taking agency from them, and that they had a space of their own to make integrative connections between their lives and their schoolwork. Here's some of Madison going on. She's talking here about, I wrote this post about how to create a personal learning network, and I mentioned some sort of famous people in my field who were doing certain kinds of work, and oh my gosh, this post got shared by one of those famous people, right? She could hardly believe it. And then she's like, look at this, 7,000 people looked at my tweet about this, right? And I had these engagements, and she was looking at the blog record, and she was seeing that people were reading the blog that the tweet was sending them to. There's a guy at University of New Hampshire who talks about this. He just recently published, he's an autism scientist, basically the science behind autism, and he published a scientific paper, and it had maybe 18 citations, which was good, right? That was like a pretty good impact factor for his paper. And then he published a blog post about that work, and it had 5 million hits, right? So there's something to be said here for the way that we take our academic knowledge, our own and students, and we move them into these public venues so that people can interact with the research. So she started getting excited about that. You can also see here where she says, building a community of support came from my amazing academic community where the program shared my work, right? So here's a tweet from our program about some of Madison's work. Of course, that's just me, right? That's just me tweeting out Madison stuff. But to her, that's her program, sort of an academic institution bumping her work. Now, we have people who follow the program because they're interested in the work that's doing it. It immediately brought her work into a whole new audience. And then here is Madison interacting with Kat, sharing stuff, right? So, hey, you might like to see this particular thing. Well, what do you think about that? Is this, so these are students talking to each other about these networks that they're becoming part of. And they're becoming part of these scholarly and academic networks, both by receiving stuff off the web, but also by contributing their stuff back in and sharing it back out. So the idea is when these guys are ready for internships or first jobs, they don't go to the career services office and flip through some random binder, right? They've developed kind of a community, a professional community of practice that they're able to engage with to find what their next step is going to be after college. So for me, the trajectory went kind of like this. I got that books were expensive, and I found out about OER, but then when I got invested, I really thought, wow, this is a whole new conversation about access to knowledge that me, with my sort of R1 research background, had thought was not my problem, right? So I became interested in access issues and then realized that I didn't just want my students to be consuming, but also to be contributing as well. So that access to knowledge creation brought me to what we are now starting to call open pedagogy, which are the collection of sort of teaching techniques that surround the idea that we want students to have access to knowledge and access to knowledge creation. That is too hard to see. It's a fancy slide, though. Look, that took me a lot of YouTubing to figure out how to make that go. And it almost looks like it's going all the way across, but it's not. But this is a little provocation from Audrey Waters, who is concerned about the idea of kind of a permissionless society. The idea here is, in what ways are people going to be exploited on the web by powerful markets if we just share our stuff? I'll give you one classic example that people rightfully ask me about, right? Let's say you make some course materials. In fact, maybe you create a whole course, and you openly license it. And you say anybody can use this in any way that they want. And we put a license like CC BY. As long as you say I did it and you give me attribution, anybody can use this. And now let's say you're, not your institution, because SUNY would never do this, but some sinister institution, perhaps a for-profit institution, right, takes your course and installs some kind of a robo-teacher and just uses your materials to teach your course in a hideous way that's part of an exploitive market that's charging students too much money, right? What if you are contingent faculty and you share your materials, and those materials are used in some ways to sort of, again, devalue the teacher and your job security is threatened, right? What are the ways in which sharing can make us vulnerable? There's all sorts of other ways that sharing can make us vulnerable online, right? What happens, for example, I used to teach freshman composition, and I had a student writing about her religious family and coming out of the closet as a young lesbian when she was first year in college. That's a pretty different thing to write on the web, right, than it is to write for your professor or even, say, in Blackboard for a small community of learners. Are we prepared for the reality of a very flawed web right now? So one of the things I would suggest is that we try to pay attention to some of the trouble spots here. For example, OER is free to use but not free to create. So we continually make visible the academic labor that's at the core of this stuff. I think that means if you want to make stuff with your students as part of the class, that seems very fair. It's a lot of how I work with OER. But if you're going to be making OER, over the summer, and you're, say, contingent faculty, and you're not salaried, and you're not working on those months, how are we going to seed and support those things? You may have heard a rumor about SUNY and the many millions of dollars that are flowing. The world is watching, right? Because right now you have this amazing opportunity because you do have resources. The federal government has resourced $5 million towards OER for the next budget cycle, and you guys have $8 million across New York. What this means, though, is that your campuses need help in figuring out where best to put those resources in order to build the open resources that we need. One of the things I would suggest is to keep looking long-term, right? So it's not just about what small thing can I do right now, but what do we need to procure? Where are the gaps? What things don't exist yet? So that you can really make a larger contribution, because people are watching New York right now, right? Because you guys are the leaders of open, and you have the resources. So folks like Alexis and Mark will help your system put this stuff together. But also to realize that sharing is a consensual act. Nobody should be forced on the web. Nobody should be forced to openly license materials. There are some exceptions to that. For example, if you take public dollars through a grant, I would really prefer that you publish the results of the research that you did with my taxpayer money in an open access journal so that the public doesn't have to pay twice to access your research. But in general, allowing people full and total autonomy and privacy is important in the age of Cambridge Analytica, where we are being mined and stripped by what I would call a very corporatized web. And what we're trying to build here is something different. It's a public web. It's a public infrastructure. And we have to be mindful of the ways that we can't just immediately become public when we are so privatized as a technology right now. One of the ways I think about building a public web is by looking at scholars like David Bolyar, who He is actually, so he writes about the commons, but he works, I think, in environmental science, and you'll see a lot of the kind of permaculture and sustainability ideas that come out of his work. In this quote, he's reacting to Hardin's work in the 60s, which was a very famous phrase that you might know called the tragedy of the commons. And basically what the tragedy of the commons is this idea that you've got an open resource, let's call it a meadow, a field, and it's open to all, and so a whole bunch of cows from like the most powerful rancher down the street, like he brings all his cows in, they strip that resource away, and ultimately it's depleted and not usable anymore. And therefore, open access, sharing, the commons, these are ideas that are flawed and don't work. That was the tragedy of the commons. You might think about that as sort of the Nestle model, right? Like you take a free resource like water, and then a very powerful company comes in, depletes until you end up with an environmental emergency, say. But Bolyar says this is actually kind of not the right way to think about the commons. He says the commons is frequently confused with an open access regime. It's a free-for-all in which a resource is essentially open to everyone without restriction. Common resources are taken for sale on markets. In contrast, a real commons has a social infrastructure of cultural institutions, rules, and traditions, and the resources are restricted to personal, non-market uses by members of the community. Without that infrastructure, the only operative social value is private profit for the most aggressive appropriators. So one of the questions I have, right, mostly for my students, not for you, right, because we're not going to fix the web, but they might, right? The next generation might. So the questions I want to ask them is what does it look like to have a commons-oriented higher education? What does it look like to have a commons-oriented World Wide Web? Sustainable for the public, and not being strip-mined by the most aggressive appropriators. So when I think about this in the context of public higher education, that's when I really start to see an end game here, because the end game for me is not free textbooks for all. The end game for me is accessible higher education for and by the public. So when I think about that, I think about some of the ways that we now talk about the value of public higher education. We say a lot about the college earnings premium, and this is basically how much more money you're going to make in your life if you go to college than if you don't go to college. And you know what? It's damn fine, right? So like that helps us. It's good. Over the course of your lifetime, you're likely to have about 114% higher sort of total life income if you go to college. So this is great, and that's kind of often the end of the conversation because that is enough, right? And when we're talking about a private market good. I actually think the college earnings premium has been destructive to us in some ways, because what it has done is it's suggested that the only reason public higher education is important is because of the private market value it can deliver to you. And once we accept that as the total value of public higher education, we've kind of lost the larger debate, I think. So it's not that we have to say that's not true, but we need to go a little bit further than that. So I tend to use the work of Philip Trostel. He's wonderful. He's at the University of, is it Southern Maine? He's in Maine. No, University of Maine, I think. And he's done some great work about really larger ways of thinking about and quantifying the college, the value of education. And I will say he is also an economist, right? So we can still put it in these terms that, like, you know, our general cultural climate right now is really interested in. But there are private benefits of going to college beyond the college earnings premium. For example, your employment fringe benefits are likely to be better if you go to college. You will have lower unemployment, you will have better health, you will have a lower possibility of becoming disabled. And by the way, the methodologies on these are tight, they are good. So in my head, the question I asked Philip was, well, yeah, but maybe it's just because if you are disabled, you are less likely to complete college because there are barriers to completion. He says these are all, they've controlled for all of these factors, right? So it seems hard to believe, but you are actually less likely to become disabled if you complete college, less likely to be imprisoned, higher life satisfaction, better marriage, 25% lower mortality rate. Your life expectancy goes from 74 to 81. And weirdly, even though these are not really genetic things, a lot of these things can be partially passed on to your children and benefit, right? And then beyond that, beyond the private, right, we have these external benefits that drift to the public, right? So, for example, there's productivity spillover in regional income, which means if the region that you are in is more college educated and you are not college educated, you are likely to have a higher income because of that regional productivity spillover. Greater tax revenues, of course, right? So the public pays itself back because the incomes are higher. Reduction of need for public assistance and lowered crime and reduction in dollar amount of harm to crime victims. Look at some of this, right? Each potential college degree is conservatively worth $481,000 once you take out the costs of college, right? That's the profit on that. What Trostel shows is that the net government spending on higher ed is negative when you take the full value, right? So when you say, oh my God, the taxes are so high, look what we're paying for all of this. And in New Hampshire, we don't say that, right? Because in New Hampshire, we're 50th in the nation. Great job, New Hampshire. 50th in the nation for public funding of higher ed. So my university is about 9% publicly funded, right? So I don't even know what makes that a public university, quite frankly. But what we're talking about, not just in New Hampshire, but every place, right, is that actually we are making money off of public higher education because of this suite of benefits. The rate of return on taxpayer investment in college students is 10%. How much is your money making you and whatever investments you are currently holding? Because it's hard to find an investment that looks that good, including also to state and local governments. So part of what I'm thinking when I'm doing all of this work is that we need to think about public higher education. I can't remember if I auto-timed these or if I have to click them. Public higher education should be sustainably funded with public dollars. When I say that, I'm talking about let's make some textbooks where basically we invest in the learning materials that we need instead of subbing this out to for-profit companies that skim off the top. It's about a sustainable, commons-oriented ecosystem. And let's make that part of a general understanding of college as a public good, where the public pays itself for what it needs, right? If we sustainably support our funding structures, we should also build infrastructure inside and around colleges that allows us to work. That's why I tend to be skeptical about the movement, and a great person on this is Christopher Newfield in his book, The Great Mistake, How We Wrecked Public Universities and How We Can Fix Them. And in that book, he talks about a devolutionary cycle, where basically we get in budget trouble, so we sub out to external contractors, and that puts us deeper into budget trouble, right? And it just goes around and around. He studied 3 state systems in depth in order to arrive at the data that he has in that book. So what should we as faculty, as designers, as librarians, as admin, what should we be advocating for in order to keep the funding cycle sustainable and publicly oriented? We should be committed to broad access. When we think about access, we should think about as many of those points as we can. So that includes everything from housing insecurity to textbooks to accessibility and universal design, the whole suite of related things that will allow us to build a higher ed to bring as many learners to the table as we can. We want to transcend academic and institutional borders. So for me in my program, that's partially about interdisciplinarity and collaboration, which happens more in the real world sometimes than it does in institutions. How can we reduce territorialism between departments in order to better share resources and courses and be more efficient that way? But also, how can we stop thinking of ourselves as competitor institutions and start thinking about ourselves as partner institutions, right? I mean, you may have a community college or another SUNY 4-year within a small number of miles, and you you talk all the time on your campus about what you can do to steal their enrollments, right? This is not a solution for the funding crisis and the demographic slide in the Northeast, right? We need to increase transferability, increase partnerships, share materials, right? All those kinds of things, I think, are part of this larger ethos that I'm talking about here. If we just keep, for example, increasing our discount, like, bigger sales and sales as we increase our discount rates in institutions, really what we're doing is just creating an unsustainable market competition between people that are supposed to be part of a system. And I'm not even talking about just a state. I'm talking nationally, right? Let's start at the state level, and then let's just think of all of our public institutions as partner institutions. And that's what I just said, and it's still good. Expect collaboration rather than competition. And develop learners as citizen contributors to the knowledge commons. There is not a knowledge commons right now, right? So the thing I'm talking about here is aspirational. What I want to do is I want to involve our students in what I sort of started calling bricolage. It's a term from my old days as a literary critic. So if you're an English professor, philosopher, you're with me right now. It's Derrida. Don't be scared. So Derrida talks about the difference between an engineer who's got to build a bridge from A to B. So he triangulates the positions and he buys the materials and it measures everything 5 times and builds a very sturdy bridge, and you go from A to B. But the bricoleur, the base of that word is like play. The bricoleur takes whatever broken pieces exist right now and hacks them together to get from A to B. What we are now, I think, is bricoleurs, right? We are taking a broken web and we're taking a broken public system, and we're saying we have aspirations that we can move someplace better. But to do this, we have to involve our students in all of these conversations, because it's more likely to transform in a subsequent generation than it is tomorrow, right? So it's about putting our aspirations in line. It's about demanding from our administrators that we start using the language of public without embarrassment, with excitement for how practical and sustainable a model like this would actually be. And I think particularly faculty can think in your teaching, in your pedagogy, but also in your scholarship with open access and public impact, and in your service, things like the food pantries and the child care. And right, can we start thinking more broadly about our jobs so that we really become ambassadors of a public intellect, right? And that's the other thing I just said, which I also still believe in. And that's the end. So I think I left, a good amount of time, and I know Alexis has the mic for the recording, but I'm happy to answer questions, but also to just chat with each other, because, after today I kind of go home, but you guys stay a cohort of some sort, and talking to each other, I think, is also really valuable.
What is green light grading? I've never run into that before.
Yeah, you never run into it because we made it up. So yeah, I love that. And actually, sometimes I tell my students, they're like, on my e-port, I blah, blah. I'm like, just so you know, that's not a word other people know. So what happened was when we started transforming, so the program I run is really interesting and exciting. In 2014, so we've existed since 1974, this interdisciplinary studies program. And from 1974 to 2014, we averaged 10.1 students a year. And I always laugh because I'm like, the poor 0.1 guy was having a really hard time in the program. But 10.1 students. And in 2014, we changed to an open pedagogy model. We did not change our content or our procedures or anything else, only pedagogy. And since 2014 until now, we've grown. We have about almost 130 majors now. So we went from being one of the smallest majors at Plymouth State to being one of the largest in about, 3.5 years. The pedagogy was transformational. And as we started getting into it, we sort of took this learner-directed approach, learners creating course policies, creating curriculum, writing textbooks. We went to radical access. That's kind of the mantra in my head all the time. This is radical access. So what do I need to do? to make knowledge more accessible and to make knowledge production and contribution more accessible to my students. So it started getting weird because everybody was so into this, it just completely took off. And then you'd be like looking at the report, you're like, well, B-, because, it was just completely out of step with the ethos of students owning their educations, right? So I have a sort of interdisciplinary faculty, and we moved to a pass, no pass grading model, which is available at the university. Which I also like because it's not pass fail, so that's a little bit good for me, right? It's just pass or no, you haven't passed this yet, So pass, no pass. And so then on a micro level, in order to enact that in the class, we installed what we call green light grading. And I say we, I don't really mean our council, I mean our students. So we hacked this together as a sort of student project. We did attendance policies, we did grading policies. And green light grading basically says, here's the assignment. When we deem, sort of collectively, but I'm a big part of that, when we deem that the work that you've done is shareable to the commons, we green light it, and you move on to the next thing. When we don't think it's shareable yet, it's just not green lighted yet, and that's all there is, green lighted or not green lighted yet. In order to pass the course, you need 100% green lights for every single assignment. But you have kind of infinite time, and by infinite, I mean infinite. And I know this is a huge privilege, but if a student isn't all the way done at the end of the course, I'll give them an incomplete. Just keep on working. It happens very rarely, but occasionally it does. So shareable to the commons is really interesting. It's not a normal standard, because, for example, I had a guy, he wrote a really awesome blog post about a friend of mine, Gardner Campbell, who writes really interesting stuff about the web, and he called him Campbell Gardner. Campbell Gardner's piece is blah, 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 blah. Everything else about this post was amazing. So if you just got that as a standard paper in a class, you might give them like an A-. You might say, this is great, by the way, that you got the guy's name wrong. You got to fix it, right? Or you might even give them an A and say, you got to fix this or whatever. But you can't share that on the internet, Like, I want to share, Gardner's going to read this, right? It's hugely embarrassing for the student and for Gardner Campbell, right? So that was not green lighted. Even though it was really wonderful. So we think less about, is this good or bad, and more about what work is this piece going to do, and what does it need in order to do it. It does not have to be perfect. We all share things all the time that are not perfect. I want to build a web where we share imperfect things, because that's the whole spirit of open. Improve, revise, remix, and that's how we're going to get to a better culture, right? A better society. So that's how green light, it's basically what I consider to be like subversive competency-based grading. But the CBE, like competency-based education, has also some very conservative drifts to it. So I think we fork off of that a little bit.
Now, in terms of the green light grading, how does that work when there are kind of fundamental conflicts in opinion on the subject matter, as opposed to just kind of the quality?
You mean like if somebody writes something where like we don't agree on the opinion of the piece? Is that maybe what you mean?
Yeah, where you're looking more at like that type of thing.
Yeah, so for people who teach things where that stuff is normal, I don't think this changes that from any of the old models. So for example, I used to be an English professor, and or like I teach first year seminar, for example, and I had some folks write some really great stuff about Black Lives Matter, and did not see eye to eye with that stuff at all. This was before ePorts, this was before green light grading, and I still had the same exact dilemma, right? So really, I handle it here the same way I handle it there, which is, have you logically proven, have you cited, if you're using sources, are these sources credible? And we go through that same stuff. Now, if at the end, you end up with a radically different opinion than me, total green light. But if in the context of making these arguments, you have, for example, cited fake news sources that are really problematic or what. So the other thing that I love about the web is, like, I had, again, with one of these, it was related to Blue/Black Lives Matter. they wrote what I think was definitely a green light post. You know, it was fine, it was shareable, and I was offended by it quite a bit. But I had what we love to call the comments area, right? So in the comments area, I just explained the disgusting offense that I took, but I explained it in a way that was professional enough and respectful enough as a teacher and also as a human, because I needed to prevent my student from deleting my comment, because of course my student moderates their site. So I had to be really smart, because I knew if I just said like, yeah, blah, 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 you know, they would just delete me, which I also thought was a really awesome inverse of the power dynamic. But I'm a smart cookie, right? So I was able to write a post that I think, you know, anybody reading his post and my post would clearly come to my opinion at the end. But that's really how I got released totally from grading, right? I don't grade anymore, I comment, right? And I comment on my students' blogs the same way I comment on anybody's blog that is somebody I respect, you know? So I treat them professionally, but I do not mince words, you know, about problems that I see in their arguments or questions that I have, things I think that they still need to push forward on. I will just put all of that in the comments. Sometimes I'll get a little more micro, so sometimes I might be like, oh, there's like kind of a couple of comma splices in here, you know, and then at the end of that I'll usually be like, if I were you, I'd delete this comment, right? Because occasionally I can't contain the professorial voice, you know, and plus students really want grammar feedback. That's what I find. Like they put stuff on the web, they care a lot more than they care about their papers. So sometimes they appreciate that stuff, and if I know it's going to be real micro edits like that, sometimes I'll just put them in a separate comment so that they can moderate that off.
I have a question. I'm a real big fan of your Anthology project. In fact, I just got an email from Rebus while we were sitting here that advertised they're still looking for writers. But one of the things I was wondering, since it started as your project and you licensed it with that CC BY license, I was wondering how you felt when derivative works of your original don't have you listed as the first author or recognize you, and how that deals with your openness.
I'll tell you, like, the level of fame that I have reached for this anthology so far surpasses the quality of the work that I put in, that it would be in poor taste to complain in any way. No, I thank my lucky stars every day for, honestly, the opportunity that sharing that initial build has opened up to me. So I'm thrilled. And also, they're really, Rebus and Tim, who's the current editor, because they are so informed about the ethos of the Commons, they cannot stop thanking me enough, right? It's just like, I feel like it's all the time they're throwing credit my way, which is part, I think, of the ethos of the Commons, right? Is not only to improve and revise, but also to acknowledge. So I feel quite acknowledged by that. I had something else I was going to say about that, though, that I just slipped my mind. It was about another project. Oh, I know. So that anthology project spurred another project. It's called the Open Faculty Patchbook by Terry Green, worth Googling. This is just like people who do cool teaching stuff, and he basically put together a little anthology. It's actually nothing like the Open Anthology of American Literature. There's no connection at all. But somehow he felt inspired by my project and he built that. When you open out the Open Faculty Patchbook, there's a big picture of me, and it's like, Robin DeRosa has, you know, and it's like hysterical because I had nothing to do with it, right? So I feel like the rewards that flow back to me from sharing are so much beyond anything I ever saw in my copyrighted days that it just blows my mind. Speaking of Open Learner Patchbook and whatever, I want to tell you about a new site that my collaborator, Rajiv Jangiani, and I just put together. It's called openpedagogy.org. And if you go to openpedagogy.org, it's just sample open pedagogy assignments and ideas, stuff that faculty are trying out. And there's some cool stuff. We just started it about a month ago, so I don't know what's in there now, maybe like 15 or something things. But if you also have done something with OER or with any of the kind of pedagogies that we're talking about here, just, take a paragraph or two, write it up, and there's a submission channel right there on the site, so you can just put it right in, and then Rajiv and I we don't really edit it as much as we sort of clean it up and format it and publish it live on there. But for people who are just starting out, they're interested not just in converting to OER, but in thinking of a larger pedagogical set of possibilities, that site could be helpful to people. And I really encourage you to contribute if you know of stuff. We have student contributors on there as well.
Thank you. I'm a courseware developer, and I'm a little daunted by looking at web accessibility guidelines. And I wondered what kind of issues you've run into that with students contributing to the Commons.
Yeah, so this is the main thing we kind of took on this past year, actually this past spring, that we've really started working on with our disability office. So some of the cool parts of that is that if you look in the right places, the open community is doing some great stuff around accessibility, trying really hard to make it like once this catches on, we want it to catch on with accessibility baked in, right, as opposed to as a retrofit. It can cost, as some folks know, like you get maybe one textbook or one module can cost over $1,000 to retrofit by a single campus that just does it in isolation sometimes. So the question of baking this stuff in, I just went to the accessibility video, so I saw, I think it was at Oswego, was it? Where they've purchased some really good captioning stuff. But Pressbooks, for example, and some of the tools so I build most of my stuff in Pressbooks and with my students. So when my students work on the web, we have a little module that talks about accessibility. We start with the basics. We start with picture descriptions and captioning and all that. But for the OERs, we're just starting now in my program to try to bake some of that more in and have requirements that say we don't build unless we build fully accessibly. But I think it's, for me, the main thing is, and it wasn't until last year that I really had this shift, it's about putting those questions at the front as opposed to at the back. So you don't do the thing and then figure out who's excluded and try to fix it. You start at the front with what do we need to do when we start this project to accommodate all the different people that need access to this thing. And that's just been like so many levels of our program. But I would say the BC Campus Accessibility Toolkit is the main one that I use for kind of guiding me with accessibility issues in design, less of courses and more of resources. So they've got some people, Jess Mitchell and Tara Roberts, and people who are kind of like gurus in the field of open, who are accessibility people. If you're interested in certain angles of this stuff and you're not hooked up with those networks, just shoot me a note, usually not today, because it'll be like, there'll just be too many people in the feed, and I don't want to miss stuff, but give it a couple days and then shoot me a note, and I'll be like, oh, these are the 8 people you might reach out to who do the work that you're trying to do, because there are some leaders that I might recommend if you're not already in touch with them.
Really appreciated having you.